This is OTR FM, part of the IOM radio network.
Welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live streaming interview series, where leading new thought teachers, speakers, and authors share the intimate stories behind the 10 best spiritual books that inspired them the most on their spiritual journey. From well-known classics to hidden gems you might never have heard of, the No BS Spiritual Book Club saves you time and money by sharing reliable recommendations from those who've walked the path before you. The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello and welcome. Joining me today to share the stories behind the 10 books that impacted him the most on his life journey is a man who over the past 50 years has challenged stale doctrines, called leaders to account, awakened minds and healed wounded souls through his 40-plus books, which have had nearly 80 translations. A spiritual theologian, Episcopal priest, and activist for gender justice and eco-justice, Matthew Fox is founder of the University of Creation Spirituality in California and the Cosmic Mass. And in addition to conducting dozens of workshops each year, he's also a visiting scholar at the Academy for the Love of Learning, I love that, and the recipient of numerous awards, including the Abbey Courage of Conscience Peace Award. Matthew Fox, welcome.
Thank you, Sandy. It's good to be with you. And it's the first time I've been on a program called No BS Book Club. I like the title of your program. It's time for a little less BS in the world.
Absolutely, a lot less BS in the world.
No, not.
So let's start by you telling me about the challenge of having to pick just 10 books from the many, many, many that you've read over the years.
Yes, it was a challenge. And I'm sure I failed at it. But first of all, there's a book of nature itself. I left that out of my 10. But it's just so important. Thomas Aquinas says that Revelation comes in 2 volumes, the Bible and nature. And actually, I don't mention the Bible among that 10 either. But nature is so important to me. And that, of course, means science. And so, that's just one of the giant sources that I left out. I also left out the Tao Te Ching, which I think is one of the greatest achievements of humanity, that beautiful book. And some of my favorite mystics, I didn't include them, like Julian of Norwich, whose picture is behind me here. That's the cover of my latest book on Julian of Norwich. And because she lived through a pandemic much worse than ours in the 14th century. And she was the first woman to write a book in English, although it took 300 years for it to get published, which, as I propose, is a long time to wait for your first book review. But I think she's amazing. She was 700 years ahead of her time. She was a feminist. She developed the idea of God as mother and Christ as mother more fully than any theologian until the last 20th century. And that's why she wasn't published. And when a book did come in the 17th century, hardly anyone paid attention. And of course, Hildegard of Bingen, I've written 3 books on it, and she's a Renaissance woman, first-class genius of the 12th century. And but I didn't include some of these people I've written books about, even though obviously I have to read them. They are books I've read, these people. And of course, Thomas Aquinas, but I'll probably be quoting them as we move along anyway. But I tried to be kind of personal, look at my story. And that's why the first one I mentioned is Tolstoy's War and Peace, because I read that when I was 16. And you know how you are at 16. You're looking at life and wondering, where am I in this dream that's unfolding? And it's between school year in the summer, I read Tolstoy's War and Peace, and I told a friend it blew my soul wide open. And then I wanted to examine what happened to me. And of course, today I have language for it. It was a mystical experience. I didn't know. I just knew something happened that was important. And so in many ways, I think my vocation to pursue spirituality, I owe to Leo Tolstoy.
So what drew you to his book?
What drew it to me?
Yeah, I mean, at 16 to be reading that, had somebody told you about it?
Oh, of course. Probably my mother. She was very well read. And I'm sure probably some teacher I had in high school too. And I think I was just fascinated by it. I love that one reviewer years later I read said that, described the book this way. He said, if life could talk, life would speak thus. In other words, as in War and Peace. And that's how I felt about it, that all of life, there was a panoply, an opening of all of life there. And again, at 16, you're looking for something like that. You're looking, what is this thing all about that we call life? And as it turns out, like in my first book, I define prayer as a radical response to life. And that's interesting because that's what I felt introduced to by the words, the stories of Tolstoy in War and Peace. And of course, I got some flack from theologian types that God isn't in your definition of prayer. Where's God? Where's God? I said, chill. Practice life a little more. Maybe you'll find the divine there bubbling up. And then many years later, I read many mystics. Thomas Aquinas says God is life, per se life. And Hildegard of Bingen says God is life, God is music. And so all the mystics talk about God is life. So the fact that I got kind of impaled for leaving God out of my definition of prayer, what can I say? Again, I owe that to Leo Tolstoy too, I think.
Many people, refer to it as a great novel, but he didn't regard it as a novel, did he? He regards Anna Karenina as his first novel. He doesn't regard this one, apparently, as a novel at all.
That's interesting. How do you think he regarded it?
I don't really know. I don't know, but I read somewhere that he certainly did not regard it as a novel. I think because it carried so much, I think as a historical chronicle, probably. There's so much philosophy in there as well.
So much philosophy, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. That I didn't know that he didn't describe it as a novel. But all I know, it had the power for me, and it was significant.
But it has to be many people. It often shows up on greatest novels of all time lists, doesn't it?
Well, hear that. I'm in good company. One thing I am aware is that Gandhi was turned off by Christianity because he was living in South Africa, and a very good expression of it there. So he wasn't interested in Christianity until he interacted with Tolstoy. And as Tolstoy, he really introduced him to Christianity. And then Gandhi ends up taking the Sermon on the Mount and making it practical, turning it into the theory of nonviolence that brought down the British Empire, with no lives lost. And that also, of course, was borrowed by Dr. King and Mandela and others. So that, to me, was a very interesting connection, too, that Gandhi was very inspired by Tolstoy and Tolstoy's version of Christianity, enough so to look for himself and then create his own version of what Jesus was trying to teach. And again, it's so interesting. It took an outsider, a non-Christian. It took Gandhi, who was Hindu, to put some of Jesus' teachings into real practice, into history itself. And so that's a story in itself too, isn't it?
Absolutely. Is your list in chronological order?
I don't know. That's interesting. It begins that way, certainly. This is the only book I read when I was 16 that I'm writing about here. Just take a look here. No, not entirely, but it kind of runs together. But the other mentions are when I'm an adult. So we move from my 16-year-old stage to my being a Dominican priest and so forth, and a theologian. I did my doctorate in Paris, and one of my professors there was Père Chanou, a wonderful French Dominican who was 75 years old at the time. He had been silenced by Pope Pius XII for 15 years, forbidden to publish. And he had been involved with the Marxists in France after the war, the unions, you see, and the worker priest movement. And that kind of threatened the Vatican in the 50s and 40s. And he's also involved in trying to create a new school, a new way of pedagogy and education for priests. And that's really why he was silenced, because he wrote about that experiment. Because he was dean, he oversaw the training of Dominicans at the Sauchoir, which is Dominican House of Studies in France. But he was brought back at the Second Vatican Council in the early 60s. And interesting enough, it was a third world bishop from Madagascar who brought him along as a peritus, that is kind of a theological advisor to these bishops. And Chanou was responsible for the most radical document of Vatican II called The Church in the Modern World. he really wrote that in its basic form. And anyway, I had him in class, and he's the one who named the creation spiritual tradition for me. That's been my life's work ever since. He said there are these two streams in Western religion. One begins with the fall, and so it's about fall and redemption. The other begins with creation. And the former has been, of course, the dominant message, but I became very interested in that which began with creation. First of all, because when I studied with him in 1968, ecology and the environment was already on our agendas as human beings, if we were awake, and also because it answers so many questions to me about feminism, about non-dualism, about the role of the artist and justice, and joy as well, and science. So for me, that I remember the moment in our classroom. There's a seminar room in Paris there, and when he pointed out these two traditions, and I felt like Paul falling off the horse blinded. I was so excited because it answered my question: how do you relate mysticism to social justice? And do they relate at all? And I realized they don't relate in the fall redemption tradition, which is so anthropocentric. I mean, humans are the only ones who sin. So if you begin with the fall, you begin with the human. Now, the Bible doesn't begin with the fall. You think it did, because 95% of preachers are talking mostly about sin. But check out Genesis 1. It's cosmology. It's cosmology about the story of the universe as we got here. Now, it's not, of course, updated by 21st century science. But in fact, what's interesting is that in some ways it follows today's creation story from science, insofar as it begins with light, just as the fireball kicked off the universe as we know it. And this Hubble telescope that's going to be beaming out to us light from the beginning of the universe is going to be showing us that original light, which I think is beyond exciting. It could be a whole new beginning for humanity. God knows we need a whole new beginning. And remember, when you talk about light in today's science at the beginning of creation, or light in Genesis 1, both cases precede the sun. Because the sun, even as comes after the let there be light statement. So, and then both stories, today's in science and Genesis, ends with humanity. Humanity is at the end of the line of evolution, and up to now. So that's significant. And then in Genesis, it says everything that's born is good. The sun is good, the moon is good, the earth, the animals and the plants. And then when humans arrive, it actually says all of it together is very good. And that Hebrew word can be translated very beautiful. Everything's beautiful. Everything's very beautiful. Well, so that's we begin with creation. And that's why we have an ecological crisis, is that we didn't begin with creation. We just think that's background for us or something, as if healthy air and healthy water and healthy skies and healthy bodies and food is not, the heart of the matter. So we're learning this now the hard way through climate change, and are facing our extinction at this time in history. So I love that you name the creation tradition for all of us, and that's been my life's work.
And one of his books is on your list, and we will get to that a bit later. But like Shanu, you too got silenced by the Pope.
That's true. I was silenced for a year. Well, actually, it was 14 months. And then a few years later, they kicked me out of the Dominican order that I was in for 34 years. And they made a list of their objections to my thinking. Number one was that I'm a feminist theologian. I didn't know that was a heresy, but number two is that I call God mother. So you can see what's on their mind. This is a Rorschach test for the patriarchal version of Christianity that was so represented for 34 years of two popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Another complaint was that I worked too closely with Native Americans. Now, I don't know what that is, except that I did have sweat lodges on our Catholic campus because a good Native American was teaching in my program, and he led us in sweat lodges. I guess that's what they were threatened by. Another thing is that I cried child. Well, I don't know what Christmas is, these guys, but I think that's what Christmas is about, isn't it? So that was an objection. I mean, these objections are beyond silly. They're really, they're scary that they don't know their own tradition. And of course, I wrote a book called The Original Blessing, and that blew the roof off the Vatican. And when it got translated into Polish, I thought, oh, now Pope John Paul II, who's Polish, will get it. No, he didn't get it. So what I learned from that is that patriarchal religion is thoroughly committed to original sin, even though Jesus never heard of it. No Jews ever heard of original sin. Elie Wiesel says that original sin is not in the Bible and it's alien to Jewish thinking. So how can you have a religion that claims to follow Jesus Christ, who is Jewish, who never heard of original sin, and puts original sin up front? And original blessing is what I was talking about earlier. It's about Genesis 1. The word blessing means good. So originally there was all this goodness. And then, of course, humans messed up. But still, this goodness is what's continuing to bless us. So those were some of the objections to my work that got me expelled. And that's how life turns. And then I was writing a book at the time on the reinvention of work, which is pretty synchronistic. And I finished it with a chapter on reinventing ritual. And then I sent it to the publisher, and I went off to do a workshop in Seattle. And lo and behold, 6 young English people had phoned to me from Sheffield, England, where they were from. And they were involved in reinventing liturgy of the Anglican Church, youth, and including dance, DJ, VJ, all these, and rap, all these postmodern art forms. And I just finished my book saying we had to bring the body back to worship and silence and other things, and of course, new art forms. And here they are saying they flew in to see me and talk to me. They had a pile of newspaper articles about their work and that. So I flew to Sheffield to check it out, and I was very moved by the experience. And I said, how can I help you guys? And they said, well, we're already using your theology of the cosmic Christ and so forth. But if you were to become an Anglican priest, you could run interference for us. And because most theologians don't get why we're doing what we're doing. So I thought about it and I prayed about it. I said, well, the Pope's fired me. He doesn't need me. So I called the Episcopal bishop in San Francisco, went to meet him, and said, I'm thinking of becoming an Episcopal priest for only one reason, to work with young people to reinvent forms of worship using postmodern arts and so forth. He said, go for it. He gave me a green light, Bishop Swing, good man. And so that's what I became Episcopalian priest, to work with young people to reinvent worship. Now we've done well over 110 of these cosmic masses in North America, several times at the World Parliament of Religions. And the last meeting in Toronto there, where 500 people showed up, including Buddhist monks in their robes and all this. And many people said it was a high point of the conference for them, but also that it was a most powerful religious experience of their life and so forth. So it really does work to bring the liturgy up to date using contemporary creativity and art forms. Why not?
New York Times Magazine published an article about that, Raving My Religion, in which they said, you hope your sweaty rave masses will change the way we pray. Sounds like...
Yes, I guess they did. I think People magazine did something on it too. But I think ritual is important. Look, here in America, in August of all months, 65,000 people gather in a desert for ritual. They call it Burning Man ritual. Yeah. Now, that just shows how hungry people are for ritual. I mean, if anything, you think, well, they wait till it's February, not August in the desert. So they're willing to sacrifice too. And so that just shows that the human animal is very needy of healthy ritual that connects us to the whole, to the cosmos, where the psyche can grow and connect to the cosmos and feel
connection. That's the word, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's a need for this. And so many of the churches are so bound down and tight and all the prayers in a book. You know, you go to church, you have to be literate in today's world. You got to find out what page you're on too. And none of that interests me as prayer. I'd rather go in a sweat lodge.
Fearful.
What's that?
It's all too fearful. It's all too fearful. It's all based on fear.
Yeah, and also Rilke said 100 years ago, he said, the work of the eyes is finished now. Go and do heart work on all the images that are imprisoned within you. So heart work is what real prayer is about. And it's not about reading something else. It's about reading your own heart and putting it out there, and then inviting others to put their hearts out there. And that's why dancing our joy and grieving together. We always do a grieving practice as well at our masses. And then building up the energy to go out and do something in the world that's, that's more joyful and compassionate and just. That's what can happen in healthy ritual. And it needs to happen. And we have to get our eyes out of the books so it can happen. Yeah. Bring the body.
Well, let's look at the second book on your list, which the Village Voice described as not for the timid, and a brilliant book that was for nothing short of the overthrow itself. And it is God the Father Towards the Philosophy of Women's Liberation by Mary Daly, which was published in 1973. One of the pioneers of feminist theology.
Yes. When I wrote that book, when I read the book, I called her up. I never met her or anything. She was at the Boston College University, which is a Jesuit college in Boston. But she got in a lot of trouble with them over the years. But I called her up on the phone and I said, I just want to thank you for your book. I said, I think it's a wonderful book, an important book. And I said, I think it makes Karl Marx look like a pansy. And there's this long silence. And then she said, thank you very much. And then I invited her out to our college. There's another women's college, Barra College in north of Chicago, and to speak. And of course, we had supper together. And I realized my compliment to her was the perfect compliment, because she was a warrior. And I think she liked being compared favorably to Karl Marx. She was also an Irish woman. She had a good sense of humor, but she was tough. And when she gave her public lecture, when she was finished, it was Q&A time. She said, for questions and answers, I'm not going to call on any men. We women have been listening to your men questions for hundreds of years. Now's your chance to sit and listen to ours. With that, 40% of the faculty got up and walked out right like that. And these were undergraduates. It's an undergraduate college. And 6 months later, they were still talking about Mary Daly's lecture and what happened and everything. So I thought that was a perfect educational experience. So that's what you want to do with young people, is get them involved in something so exciting and full of questions that they're still talking about it 6 months later. Isn't that what school is about? Isn't that what learning is about? So, but for me, even beyond God the Father, that she was, and this is why I told her she was more radical than Marx, because she was dealing with language. And of course, Marx is big on caste systems and social structures and all that stuff, which is important to critique, just like Charles Dickens did the same in his way at the same time as Marx. But the whole idea of language, to me, is even more radical. If you can change the pronoun for divinity from just he to she and he, her and him, that invites 50% of the human race into the discussion, and it gives them equality at the starting line. And so I just feel that, and of course, the whole role of the aesthetic, therefore, and of art and everything is so important for, what can I say, recovering a sense of divinity. Meister Eckhart says, I pray God to rid me of God, which I think is one of the more wonderful and radical prayers I've ever heard. But you could apply it in this instance with Mary Daly, that we have to be rid of an all-male God if you're going to create cultures that are gender balanced. And by culture, I include education, religion, economics, politics, media, all of it that has been lacking because it's been so dominated, especially the education system, because that's where it all begins, is education. But, education was co-opted by patriarchy in the modern era. When it was invented in the 12th century, it was a place to find your place in the universe. University, find your place in the universe. And the goddess of wisdom oversaw both science and the arts. But gradually in the modern era, they threw out the goddess, they threw out wisdom, and became nothing but a pursuit of knowledge. And knowledge by itself can be very dangerous because it is about power. But without wisdom, it's doubtful that we use the power wisely and correctly for future generations and the rest. So I think the real undoing of patriarchy has to be faced in academia and in education. And really, half of my life has been about trying to renew education. I've not only fought popes, but I've also fought accrediting bodies because I think because I learned very early in my young 30s, I learned because I started creating programs, master's program for spirituality. In other words, you can't teach spirituality in a rational based educational system. You have to make room for the body, where the heart is after all, and for the intuition, which is what mysticism and creativity are. So I redesigned education, what I call art is meditation. So we, in my programs always, in my university, we had seminars and read books and write papers and all that stuff on the one hand for the intellectual brain, the rational brain, but also we had art as meditation and body prayer because we have to feed the intuitive brain too. And, Einstein himself said, quote, "I abhor American education," unquote. And why? He said, because you've been given two gifts, the gift of rationality, the left brain, and the gift of intuition. And he said the first should serve the second because values do not come from the intellect, he said. Einstein said values come from intuition or deep feeling, which are the same thing, he said. And so what we're doing in a system that only values the rational is we're not teaching values. It's a valueless system, which explains a lot of the judges on the Supreme Court, if I can jump to that topic right now,
yes,
and many other atrocities that happen in our world. So, and I love to quote Einstein on that because you can't accuse him of being anti-intellectual. So anyway, that's part of what I think Beyond God the Father implies, and the whole feminist movement that really stood on her shoulders in a way, Mary Daly. So I honor that very much. And like one feminist writer I really love is Adrienne Rich, the poet, and her wonderful book, essay book on Of Mother Born, a really important book on the divine on the feminine, and what's missing in our culture. And I don't know, as a man, I feel that is so important for men as well as for women, and for mothers and fathers raising boys and girls, that we have this balance and return it to and undo patriarchy. Patriarchy is a perversion of the masculine.
Absolutely.
To serve certain interests, mostly.
And a third woman whose book you admire is Clarissa Pinkola Estes, Women Who Run with the Wolves, Myths and Stories of the Wild Woman Archetype. Yeah. Exactly.
Wonderful book, wonderful woman. Well, again,
another one that you called as soon as you read the book.
It is. I did. I don't do that often, but when I'm really moved, I do crazy things. And I called Clarissa on the phone, and I'd never met her or anything, but I told her I just loved her book. I think it's one of the most important spiritual books of the 20th century. And I said to her, I think you were the Teresa of Avila of the 20th century. And she said, "Oh, wow," she said. "Teresa of Avila is my favorite saint." So I kind of hit that one on the head too, I guess. But And we've been friends. We've taught courses together. She loved teaching in my university. And I'll never forget, we taught a course together on evil, in fact. And of course, Clarissa is a Jungian. Her story is funny. She was very poor growing up. She was the only one to get education in her family. And she discovered Jung when she was a teenager in the school library. And for years, she called Jung Jung, because she never heard anyone else talk about Jung. She just found it on a page, the name on a page. So she was Jung says this and Jung says that, until she finally became a Jungian analyst and got the words right. But and she's grounded in her Latina tradition, of course, as well as she's part Hungarian and part Native American. So she brings together some amazing ethnic roots. And of course, her stories and her exegesis of the stories, is what she does in that book, are just so dynamic and powerful and deep. And I just loved that book, and I love her. Another thing she did in our program, which was very interesting in light of today's news in America, is that we didn't have a chapel in our school that I designed with a friend of mine, but we had what we called a cave, because it was a room in the middle of the place that had no windows, because it was in the middle of the upstairs campus that we had in a building in downtown Oakland, and we called it the Sacred Cave. Well, she created a ritual in there for women who had had abortions. And again, this would have been 12 years ago or so. But to me, that was a very powerful, intuitive gift that she gave to women. And because, the issue of abortion is not just having it or not having it, or having it available. So if you're going to have it, you don't get, killed in the process, which is what this real debate in America is about. But you wouldn't think so, judging from Supreme Court judges have to say. But to realize that in many cases with abortion, there is, a psychological price that people pay. Yeah. Just like there's a price people pay if they don't have an abortion too. But to address that, is important. And she addressed it. She created a ritual. And I remember sometime after that, I was doing a retreat at Big Sur in California. And a woman came up to me and said she needed to talk to me. Well, she wanted to talk to me because she had an abortion and she hadn't been able to process it. There was no ritual that she'd been given by anybody to help process it that way, And she felt a relationship with her aborted child. So, we talked together and we created a ritual together about that. So I think that's a topic that, needs attention, that we need rituals for all these passages in our life. And just throwing bombs at each other, as if you're pro or against it, doesn't get it all to the level of where these hard decisions are made. And so I think even that could help to be, an escape from.
Well, ritual gives us a chance to process and integrate experiences, and our culture does not give us those opportunities.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm very interested in grieving rituals. I'm interested in, of course, rituals for young people coming into adulthood, but also for elders today. We need elder rituals because the elders are very important. Our culture doesn't tell us that, though, at least in America, we're told that retiring is about going to the golf course or playing the stock market the rest of your life. No, it's much more serious than that. It is about relating to the youngest, the grandchildren, the new generations. And we should have a rite of passage for that are not just for the older people, but for the young too. In fact, they could help create these rites of passage with the older ones, because it's a gift that the elders have to give back, but they have to be, what should I say, honored, if you will, or become aware that this is a new stage in their life. And it's not just retirement. I call it, we should throw out the word retirement and we should bring in the word refirement. There's a new fire, a new direction in your life. as an elder, when you're not bound
Absolutely.
down by jobs and institutions. And hey, there's new energy there if we let it flow. And that's, as you say, what rituals are for.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you totally. I mean, it is an opportunity that we are sadly missing.
Yes.
But we have to move on so that we get all the books covered. Your fourth book was Karl Marx and the Bible, a critique of the philosophy of oppression by liberation theologian Jose Porfirio Miranda.
Right, from Latin America. And of course, I met many liberation theologians, and I think they've had a lot to say to not just to the Catholic Church in South America, but to people all over the world. And of course, the Vatican, under the two popes who call my work dangerous and deviant, really shut down liberation theology. And I've proven in my book called The Pope's War that they were urged to do this by the CIA. There's a gathering a few months after Ronald Reagan was first inaugurated as president. There's a meeting in Santa Fe, and of all the national security big shots, to discuss one question: how can we destroy liberation theology in South America? And they concluded in a document called the Santa Fe document, they can't kill liberation theology directly, but they can split the church. So they went after Pope Paul II with money, and I mean money. 29 times the chief of CIA, who was a radical right Roman Catholic, went to the Vatican himself directly with satchels full of cash, gave it to the Vatican, and said, give this to Solidarity, which of course was Pope John Paul's Polish thing going on in Poland. But in exchange, the Vatican went after South American liberation theologians and priests. And in fact, when they canonized John Paul II, which was a mistake, put it mildly, one priest very knowledgeable about the history of South America under him said, that man is responsible for at least 10,000 deaths in South America. And the deaths were of priests and of sisters and of lay people who were trying to stand up to the militaries, to the dictatorships, and present a grounded Christianity of justice and compassion. And of course, like Oscar Romero, they opposed Oscar Romero. There were some in Vatican who clapped when they heard that Oscar Romero was assassinated. Now, of course, he's been declared a saint, but that was not the way the Vatican treated him in his lifetime. But I love this one sentence in that book. I think is so important. I think it should be printed in bold. Quote, the greatest tragedy in theology has been the separating of love and justice. The Hebrew Bible does not separate the two. When you separate love and justice, you get sentimental love on the one hand, and you get, what would I call it? I think politically correct justice on the other. You get a cold justice. Hesed, the Hebrew word, means compassion and justice. And Meister Eckhart says, quote, compassion means justice. Well, that's the Jewish teaching. That's a prophetic teaching. That's how Jesus saw it too, therefore. And so that was a really important book for me. Now, we didn't miss story, did we?
No, that's coming next.
Okay.
That's number 5.
Thank you.
Universe story.
My numbering is a little different from yours, but that's okay. You got a later version.
It may be the way that we put them up on the website and balanced out the length of them. But the universe story, from the primordial flaring forth to the Echozoic era, a celebration of the unfolding of the cosmos, by Thomas Berry and Brian Swin.
Right. Well, I knew both men well. Brian Swin was on my faculty for many years, and together he and I met Thomas Berry. It was Brian's idea, because Brian was a physicist and cosmologist, pardon me. And he discovered Thomas Berry's work, which was not well known, And he got really excited about it because Barry, who was a real scholar and a professor at Fordham University of World Religions, he learned Chinese, he learned some Native American languages, and of course he was very close to Teilhard de Chardin. He headed the Teilhard de Chardin Society in New York for 10 years, but he also studied today's science very, very diligently. But of course, when Brian, who was much younger, met him, Tom Barry got all excited because he was now bringing a scientist into his worldview and his consciousness that we have a new creation story from science itself. And that he felt that the number one obstacle to ecology was that we had lost a sense of the sacred for nature. Now, Thomas Barry was named after Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Barry was a priest in the order, not a real well-known order, but he rarely worked as a priest. He would spend all his time studying. He was a real scholar and student, and he would study. And after prayers at 2 a.m. in the morning, he would stay up for the rest of the morning studying. And that's what he did with his life. He was a very brilliant guy. But so the two of them teamed up and wrote this wonderful new creation story, the universe story, drawing from science. And now, of course, there have been many other books similar to that have come out since, which is fine, and that's wonderful. But they did a great job. Again, like Mary Daly's book, it was kind of earth-shattering. It was breaking, pioneer work to bring together science and well, one word that Barry used was lyricism. That really the new science needs ritual, it needs celebration. This new discovery of how the whole universe has been operating for 13.8 billion years. And if we run the movie backwards, it all started together, smaller than a zygote before the fireball, before it burst into the fireball. So they tell the whole story, and but they tell it in not just with the scientific facts, which are there, but also in kind of a lyrical and poetic fashion as well. Because Barry felt that ritual, again, is what was needed to get this new story around the world. And it is a universal story. It's not restricted to any one Christian or religious belief or anything like that. Yeah, we're all come from the same matter and the same supernova explosions. And we're all here on the same earth. So it really is a basis for environmental work, as a basis for reinventing education and religion and the way we see the world. And again, though, in many ways, I say it echoes Genesis 1. Let's begin where it all began, with the universe, not with our petty little problems and ideologies, but with the universe that brought us here. And so I think it is a very archetypal work. And I think they did a wonderful job. And every time I heard Thomas Barry speak, and I heard him lecture probably 25 times, every time he quoted Thomas Aquinas. And one of his favorite quotes of Thomas Aquinas was, excellent thing in the universe is not the human. The most excellent thing in the universe is the universe itself. And we're all here to serve the universe. That is so important. It gets us out of our anthropocentrism, what Pope Francis calls our narcissism. And we are narcissistic as a species. We weren't before the modern era, but pre-modern thinking, whether indigenous thinking or medieval thinking, and this is where I love these medievals, Hildegard, Francis, Aquinas, Eckhart, Julian, they begin with the universe. They don't begin with themselves. Yeah, we got our woes and all this, but you begin there. How are you going to find solutions? Begin in a bigger context, please. And by the way, Julian, who's over my shoulder here with this painting, she's 14th century. And Thomas Barry says that it was the Black Death, the pandemic of the 14th century, that killed creation spirituality in the West, because people got so freaked out. They became afraid, and fear became the number one issue. And so then they said, oh, it's because of our sins that we're being attacked by this plague. And so then sin took over first place in theology and religion. And you see that, of course, in the Reformation that came 150 years later, and, I'm saved and you're not, and you're a sinner and you're going to hell, and all this stuff that's been in the airways for 500 ridiculous years. This is, again, what Barry was fighting. And that's why he loved creation spirituality, that, hey, we're beginning with the cosmos. And that's the great mystery. And that is the great sacrament, the sacrament of the universe.
Yeah. The bigger picture.
The bigger picture, exactly.
Yeah. So book number 6, this is by Chenu, Nature, Man and Society in the 12th Century, which is filled with essays on new theological perspectives in the Latin West.
Yeah, well, again, I spoke to who Chenu was, and he was my mentor. But this book I love very much. It's considered a classic for sure. And it's really a collection of his essays. And the course I had Chenu in was called Spirituality in the 12th Century. And he would bring in big art books about the cathedrals and so forth. And he would, go through pages and say, you can't study spirituality without the artist. And notice what the artist did in the 12th century. What's the messages are in these cathedrals. And he called it a new humanism. There's a great humanism in the 12th century. And of course, also a great resurgence of the goddess, of the divine feminine. In 50 years, they created 500 cathedrals the size of Notre Dame de Chartres to Notre Dame de Paris. Everyone dedicated to Notre Dame, Our Lady, to the feminine. And of course, it was the Gothic Revolution that allowed, instead of the Romanesque squattiness, defensiveness, and thick walls and small windows, you had these tall structures, of course, with light and wonderful stained glass revolution, and a sense of space and air, much more feminine. And Otto Rank says that if you want to know the soul of a culture, go to its architecture first. And I think that's what Chenu was emphasizing there. And I'll never forget when long after I graduated, I would return to Paris periodically and I'd visit him. And the last time I saw him, he was 95 and he was blind. And he put his arm around me like this. And he said, never forget, the greatest tragedy in theology of the last 300 years has been the divorce of the theologian from the painter, the dancer, the potter, the artist, and the filmmaker. Of course, that's very French to include the filmmaker in the history of art. But that always stuck with me. And that's one reason why I think I had the intuition to create programs which included artist meditation, that all of our pedagogy included artist meditation. Yeah. Because it's in art that we get to our true images, to our true experiences. So I would have classes on clay as meditation, dance as meditation, painting as meditation, of course, singing as meditation, sculpture, even massage as meditation. And it's in those classes that people really got in touch with their deeper self. And wonderful things, wonderful conversions happened in people's lives because they got out of their heads and they were instructed by these wonderful artists that I would hire as teachers for whom art was a spiritual practice, not just a technique or something. And of course, we had body prayer on every morning of every day that we were in session. We began the morning that way. Circles of dances, universal peace, the dances from many traditions, Eastern and Western. And again, the body, honoring the body, bringing it into prayer and into study, into the study place called school. That was so important. So I owe Chenu a lot for that. And this book of his on the 12th century for me is an exciting book. It's a scholarly book, but I used it as a text for undergraduate students at Barry College, and they loved it. They got it. I had to walk them through it sometimes, of course. It wasn't something you'd read just in your dorm on your own, but they got it. Here's a deep thinker talking about, and Chenu said that the 12th century was the only Renaissance that worked in the West. The 16th century Renaissance, which is all we hear about, was top down. It was popes hiring Michelangelo and all that. But the 12th century, he says, worked because it was from the bottom up. It was freed serfs, and it was women, and it was the poor who gave birth to the cities that exploded in the 12th century, and of course to the Latin Quarter, to the universities that were invented in the late 12th century, and who took the power away from the monks, who were so in bed with the feudal system, which was land. And then all that energy and power moved to the cities, and where the young people had fled to, among others. And so you had this wonderful nonviolent revolution, if you will, what he called the 12th century Renaissance. So that always moved me, and I've always been looking since, I think, for what are the signs of Renaissance in our time, at this time around the world.
So, book number 7, The Genesis of Faith, The Depth Theology of Abraham Joshua Heschel by John Merkel.
Yeah. Well, I've often said if I was alone on an island and I was allowed 2 authors, 2 books, it would be the work of Rabbi Heschel on the one hand, and the work of Howard Thurman on the other, the African-American mystic. Because I think both of them just bring a tremendous depth and richness to the soul. Now, I also know that in my head, I've memorized so much Hildegard and Eckhart and Aquinas that I don't need their books with me. They're in my head. But Merkel is interesting because he was a lay Catholic who got his doctorate at Louvain University in Belgium, but he did it on Rabbi Heschel. And he produced this book. He's done other books, but I just love this book. The Genesis of Faith, The Depth of Abraham Joshua Heschel. It's so wonderfully done because it's like an index or encyclopedia of all of Heschel's work. So there's this wonderful index, and you can look up, for example, awe or wonder, which is one of Heschel's favorite themes. He says awe is the beginning of wisdom. He talks about radical amazement and all this. So it's a real important theme to him. But of course, he writes about it in this book and that book and this book. Heschel wrote lots of books, but what Merkel does was he'll have the theme of awe, and then he'll bring in passages from Heschel, from so many of his different works. So you really get a rich naming of what this important concept is about. And he does that with all the important concepts, including, liturgy and worship and prayer and meditation and justice and all this stuff. Of course, Heschel, as many people know, walked with Dr. Martin Luther King at Selma, and he was very abused for doing so. His daughter, who I met, Suzanne Heschel, who's a feminist theologian now, she says when she lectures to Jewish groups, she says, if you have that iconic picture of my father walking with Dr. King at Selma, take it down. You don't have a right to show it because you did not support my father when he needed the support. And it is true that Heschel got a lot of flack from the Jewish community for marching against segregation in the South. And their argument was, look, there's enough anti-Semitism in our world without also bringing in the segregation question, the black question. But Heschel didn't pay any attention to those criticisms. He kept marching. Once when he came for marching with King, his daughter, who was 9 or 10, said, Daddy, what was it like marching like that? And he said to his daughter, I felt that my feet were praying. I felt my feet were praying. And you have to know how courageous it was to march at that time. I mean, you've probably seen the movies of John Lewis being beat up and so forth, and they had dogs and they had fire hoses and of course police on horses and everything, blocking the street and everything. So I mean, it was a very risky option to take. And so Heschel wrote the major book on the prophets. It's about this thick. It's a very scholarly work. So he wrote about the prophets, but didn't stay in his ivory tower or in his comfortable synagogue. He marched. He did what prophets do. And he says the essence of what prophets do is to interfere. He interfered with racism. He interfered with injustice his whole life long. So I just love Heschel's work. And because he's a Jewish rabbi, I think he's the kind of person who taught Jesus. I feel when I'm reading Heschel that I'm getting much closer to what Jesus was all about. And there's been enough anti-Semitism in Christianity to last forever. And instead, we should be reading people like Heschel who see the world as Jesus saw the world. And it's not the way St. Augustine saw the world, who invented the idea of original sin. And it's not the way patriarchy sees the world. So I respect Heschel profoundly. I think he's one of the great saints of the 20th century.
Book number 8 is The Transformation of Nature in Art by Ananda Kumaraswamy, an extraordinary woman who was fluent in 36 languages. 36.
I know, isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
He had an interesting story, Kumaraswamy. He was born in Sri Lanka, but he grew up in India. And when he came of age, they sent him to England for college. But then the First World War broke out. And they wanted to conscript him in the British Army for the First World War. And he refused to go in because he was from India, and India was still being colonized by the English. And so, back then, when you thought of an Englishman, you didn't think of someone with an umbrella and proper etiquette. I mean, they were tough back when they were running an empire. And what did they do to him for not joining the army? Threw him out of the country. And he landed in Boston. And that's where he spent most of his life. And he got a job in a fine arts museum, really. But he was an amazing scholar. And as you said, he was fluent in 36 languages. And this book, The Transformation of Nature and Art, is a really fine book. He wrote it in the 30s. And there's a whole chapter on Meister Eckhart. Now, when I read that book, that chapter on Eckhart changed my life because it was the first real introduction I had to Eckhart. Moreover, there were whole sentences that he quotes in Eckhart that I had published that year in an essay on space and time. I mean, they were my sentences, but here Eckhart had written them in the 14th century, and Kumaraswamy had translated them in the 20th century. So this blew my mind. In fact, it was kind of spooky for me. I put the book, Kumaraswamy's book, back on the shelf. I didn't finish it. It was so kind of spooky. Then a few months later, I tiptoed back to the shelf and pulled it down and finished it. And I knew I had a friend in Meister Eckhart. And that's why this book is so important to me. It was my introduction to Eckhart. And my most recent book on Eckhart, I've done 3, but in my most recent one, I put him in the room with different thinkers. So in chapter 1, he's in the room with Heschel. In chapter 2, he's in the room with Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Berry, cosmology. Chapter 3, he's in the room with Thich Nhat Hanh, Buddhism. But down the line, I put him in the room with Kumaraswamy and Father B. Griffiths, who was a British monk who lived in India for 50 years. So the whole Hindu connection. And Kumaraswamy says that reading Eckhart is like reading the Upanishad. That is the greatest compliment a Hindu could make of anybody. And he also says the whole sentences in Eckhart that feel like they were written in Sanskrit. So the point is Eckhart is the world's deepest ecumenist. That Buddhists claim him as Buddhist, and Heschel, we could claim him as a Jew. Heschel never read him. I will do that for him. I have a chapter 2 on Black Elk and Eckhart because he's so indigenous in a lot of his teaching, but also that he is Hindu and Sufi. That Rumi and Hafiz actually were on the earth when Eckhart was. Both of them were. And Eckhart has been called a Sufi by Sufi scholars. So, and he's a feminist. I have a chapter on Adrian Rich and Mr. Eckhart, too. He's a very strong feminist. he backed the Beguines of the Middle Ages, the women's movement in the Middle Ages. So again, I owe Coomerswamy for my basic introduction to Eckhart. Now, I never heard Eckhart's name once in my training as Dominican, and Eckhart was a Dominican. But you see, he was condemned a week after he died by corrupt papacy. And so he had to go underground in the theological or religious world. The philosophers kept him alive, but the church ignored him for centuries. But now he's coming into his own again. But that's what I love about Coomerswamy, that he loved Eckhart. He introduced me to Eckhart. And interesting enough, it was a Buddhist, Dr. Suzuki, who converted Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk, through Eckhart. He told Suzuki said to Merton, read your one Zen thinker of the West, Meister Eckhart. And Merton did that in 1958. And you see there are two Mertons. There's a pre-Eckhart Merton and the post-Eckhart. The pre-Eckhart Merton is dualistic, Augustinian, plenty of shame and guilt, and introverted. But the last 10 years of his life after reading Eckhart is a prophetic Christian. He's writing about Buddhism, Sufism, indigenous people and their genocide toward them, civil rights. He was very close to King. He was very close to Thich Nhat Hanh. And of course, his last trip was to go to the East, where he met the Dalai Lama, who was 33 years old at the time. And they fell in love. They both canceled their schedule for the following day so they could have another day together. And the Dalai Lama was asked a few years ago, do you believe in God? And he said, well, yes, I do. And the journalist said, are you sure? Many Buddhists don't talk about God. What kind of God do you believe in? Dalai Lama paused for quite a while and said, I believe in the God of Thomas Merton, which I think is a pretty good endorsement of Thomas Merton. But again, it was Eckhart who converted Merton. And so again, Coomerswamy opened the door for me. And then I was in a serious car accident just after reading this article by Coomerswamy. And 2 years later, I had an operation on my back. And during my operation, Eckhart came to me and we went walking together on the beach. It's the most transcendent dream of my life. And we didn't talk. We just walked together on the beach. And from then on, I knew that I was in a destiny with Meister Eckhart.
Wow, what a story. So number 9, I'm conscious of our time. I hope you're still good, because we've still got 2 more books to cover. Centering in Pottery, Poetry and the Person by Mary C. Richards, published in 1969. And you say that you discovered this after founding your Institute in Culture and Creation Spirituality in Chicago. Right.
And I've alluded to this. So I created the pedagogy for a master's program in spirituality. And first, I was assigned actually by American bishops, believe it or not. They gave me an invitation to study education and spirituality. This was after my first book came out it was called On Becoming a Mystical Bear Spirituality American Style, where I take up the subject of prayer. And so I said yes to them. And what I did was I went to all the spirituality programs in North America that I thought were halfway interesting. And I'll never forget that one of the best ones was out at GTU in Berkeley, California. And it was a Jesuit school of theology. And a young man in the program, I'd say about 25, he leaned over while someone was talking, lecturing, and he would in my ear, we're learning about the mystics. We're not learning how to become mystics. And I thought that was really the most important lesson I learned. And I traced it back to the academic model of education. They were not doing any meditation, any artist meditation, and they weren't learning how to be mystics. It was about someone else being a mystic. And that bores me. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in democratizing mysticism and bringing the mystic out of all of us. That's what it means to be an adult, I think, is to be a lover of life. So with that background, I came up with the idea as artist meditation. So I started my program and body prayer as well. The first person I hired in my faculty was not a biblical scholar, it was a dancer. She was a Catholic sister who did circle dances. For example, she had music like the Quaker songs. It's good to be simple. I heard that right now. But anyway, and she'd lead us in circle dancing. And it was wonderful. And I saw how it affected people, including the men, for them to dance instead of talk all the time and read all the time. So anyway, after I think the first or second year of my program, I came across M.C. Rich's wonderful and important book, Centering. And she was a potter, and a renowned potter, also a poet and a philosopher, had a PhD in English literature from UC Berkeley. But she flourished at Black Mountain College, an alternative school in North Carolina. She quit University of Chicago, where she had an amazingly prestigious position. But she was bored with it. She didn't like the attitude there toward, it was too left brain. And anyway, this book has become a classic, but I was so taken by it that I wrote a long review of it and I sent it to her. And she loved what I had to say. And we became friends. And when I moved my program out to California, I invited her to come and teach, which she did. And she taught with us for many years. Students just absolutely loved her. And we did a week program in Australia, I remember, and I brought her with me. And together we visited Uluru and the navel of the universe, according to the Aboriginal people. And that was her first painting. She took up painting at 70. She says, too late for technique. But her first paintings were 3 paintings of Uluru, the great red mountain, sacred mountain, center of Australia. And we became really good friends. And she would stay at the Sisters Convent on campus at Holy Names College, and she would laugh about that. She said, I never would have dreamed that I would end up in a convent. She said her life was not, she was not Catholic, for one thing, but her life was more diverse than that. She was actually a member of the Steiner community. Rudolf Steiner was very important to her. And she lived the last 15 years of her life in a village dedicated to adults with mental disabilities and ordinary adults living together. She was one of those ordinary adults, and she would teach clay to all these people and everything. I visited there several times, but it was a beautiful existence, a community living situation for her. But she would leave them with their permission in California to teach with me. And she taught courses on clay as meditation and another one called Poetry and Word. And she would have people the first day of class make a book, sew it, and cut it, and sew it, and make a book. And in that book, they would keep their thoughts and their poems and their sketches and then share during the class. So she was a genius at art as meditation. And we did a wonderful special celebration for her on her 25th anniversary of her book, Centering. We held it at a wonderful public auditorium in San Francisco on the water there. And her close friends, Merce Cunningham, and who was the dancer, of course, and then his partner, who both of whom won the Genius Awards. They were faculty members together at Black Mountain College, so their friendship went way back, and they came for that occasion. And I'm sorry that the Zen musician, who was also her close friend and was a partner to Merce, can't remember his name right now, but they presented and everything at that 25th anniversary. And Merce was not in good health, but he created a dance with his fingers, a beautiful dance with his fingers. It was amazing. And at that time, but that was the year of silence by the Pope, so I couldn't talk at that own conference. So I wrote a letter, but I gave it to a Native American faculty member, Sister Jose Habde, who was a Franciscan sister and a Seneca woman, to read for me, but I did not know she was dyslexic. So there I am in the front row with MC next to me, and then her two friends, Merce and the other fellow, Cage, John Cage was the other one. And MC was reading my letter and saying, and she'd come to MC Richards and she'd say, CM. And every time she said CM, MC would poke me in the ribs, jab me in the ribs with her pointed elbow. And by the end of the letter, I had really black and blue ribs. But the whole thing was very fun and very funny and special. So anyway, I think that there's a reason why Centering is such an important book, and it will be for generations, because MC brought the wisdom of the artist with the help of her philosophical mind and her poetic expression to speak wisdom about what the artist gives the world. And just one sentence in that book is her statement that redemption comes through the body. And that if we increase our capacity for perception, we increase our capacity for justice and compassion. And she uses frequently this term, moral imagination. Moral imagination is such a wonderful term, and it's so important that we need imagination to make things better.
Indeed. So the last book, Beyond Psychology, by lecturer, writer, creative theorist and therapist Otto Rank, published in 1958.
Yeah, it was originally published in 1939 because he died in 1939. And it was published posthumously, yeah.
That was the earliest I could find.
Pardon me?
That was the earliest I could find.
Oh, I see, yeah. Well, that would be the latest, edition, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But it's just that it was done then. And it was posthumously. He had not finished it quite when he died. He died quite young. But, he was in Freud's original circle. He was the youngest of all his followers there. And everyone agreed he was the most brilliant. And certainly Freud did. Freud put him in charge of two of his magazines, cultural magazines, that he edited and really wrote. A brilliant man. But he broke with Freud, especially over the artist. Felt Freud was doing reductionism, saying all art comes from a bad relationship with your mother or something like that. And one of his major works is called Art and Artist. And I discovered Rank through Ernst Becker in his book, The Denial of Death, which won the Pulitzer Prize after he died. He says that Otto Rank's Art and Artist was the most important book of his life. And I read that book, and it is a very good book. But I love Beyond Psychology even more, I think. All of his books are important. And he's now being acknowledged as the father of humanistic psychology, that Rogers, Rollo May, and Maslow all stand on the shoulders of Otto Rank, and they admitted it. But Rank was vilified by the Freudians after he left Freud. And so his name is not well known in psychology circles and so forth. But one thing that I love about him in this book, Beyond Psychology, I think it's the first chapter that is on Karl Marx. Well, just the fact that a psychologist is writing about Karl Marx, and his question poses, why was Karl Marx so successful? And he said, because he appealed to the irrational of people, ordinary people and poor people, the oppressed people. And he offered hope. And Rank says our society is overly rational, which is, of course, what I was saying about our educational system. And that's really a critique of patriarchy, isn't it? This overly rational. I think life is just about numbers and power, and it's about more than that. So that's one chapter I just loved in that book. But another is on women. He says that women have to discover their own psychology. He said this psychology, of course, in 1939, he's talking about Freud, whom he knew very, very well. Freud was a father figure to him. He says this psychology is about man's last attempt to control nature this time his own. So that's just a powerful sentence about patriarchy. Control nature, control human nature. And he said, and he gave this at a lecture actually at the University of Minnesota. He said, what we need is a women's psychology by women, and we need a children's psychology, because the children have so much to teach us about being whole people, about being spontaneous and playful and joyful, that you will not find in current psychology, meaning in Freud. So I just love the title of his book, Beyond Psychology. And he has this beautiful passage where he talks about how everyone is looking for a beyond. We're all looking for a beyond.
Yeah, yeah.
I just think the word for the frontier, for edges. And in many ways, my life's work has been to move beyond religion as we know it. The spirituality is something that's beyond institutional religion. There are hints of it in religion, and when religion is healthy, then spirituality and religion go together. But very often in our recent history, it's not been healthy. And so people today, many people, especially the younger generations, are saying, I'm not interested in religion, but I am interested in spirituality. So I think even in that phrase of beyond psychology, and then too, I'm admiring the responsibility he's taking for his own vocation, for his own work. He's a psychologist. He's criticizing psychology. That's interfering. That's the prophetic role. And of course, Adorank was Jewish. And by the way, he doesn't talk about original sin, but he does talk about original wound. And he says that humanity has an original wound. And that wound is when we leave our mother. For 9 months, we've been so at peace and content and together. But then we burst out into this wild, crazy room with lights on probably and a slap on the butt. And, you know, life is a shock from then on. And he says that all the major crises we have in life are a repeat of that separation. And separation is the primal wound that we all carry. And then he says, how do we recover from that separation? He says, through art and love. These and the unio mystica, he actually uses that phrase, the mystical union, which we experience in love and in art. And to me, that just speaks volumes. And also his whole understanding of neurosis. He says all neurosis is the artiste manqué, the failed artist, that we take this creativity that we all have. And this is what I love about it. He sees creativity in everybody, not just for professional artists. We take this imagination we have and we use it to beat ourselves up with. Maybe a parent, when we were young, or a teacher or something, told us we couldn't do this or we couldn't do that. And then that tape plays over and over. And that's a creative act on our part. So it's using our gift of creativity to beat up on ourselves instead of to love life with. And I mean, he has so much to say, but here's one more insight, because we just passed through the Easter season. He says, and again, he's a Jew, not a Christian, but he says that the idea of the resurrection from Paul and Jesus is the most radical thought that humans have ever produced. Why? Because he thinks the entire history of humanity, and he traces it from the tribal stage through all these civilizations, Greece, Rome, everything else, Egyptian pyramids. He says the whole thing has been a quest for immortality. Everyone's trying to become immortal. That's why you went through the whole pyramid thing. If the pharaohs built buried correctly, then the others may participate in his immortality. Or in England, the king is dead, long live the king. So everyone participates in the immortality of the king and so forth. And of course, Donald Trump, all these towers, immortality, but name will go on and all this stuff. What he says is that Jesus and Paul, the idea of the resurrection, democratizes immortality. So now no one has to worry about death. We can get on with living. And that's his whole point. And that's where he returns to Deuteronomy. I put before you life and death, choose life. When he was a teenager, he attempted suicide because he had been sexually abused by an uncle. And of course, he failed. But he wrote in his journal, I must give birth every day if I'm going to live. And this is why he was so attracted attractive to artists. In the 30s, when he left Freud in Austria, Vienna, he went to Paris. And Anais Nin was one of his patients. In fact, she wrote the foreword to his Art and Artist book, and they became lovers for a while. And what's his name now? The guy who did Tropic of Capricorn, Tropic of Cancer.
Yeah, on the tip of my tongue.
I know my name is slipping. But anyway, he too was one of his patients. So he counseled these artists, and that's where he was most at home. But he said psychology itself is an art. And that's why he stepped away from Freud's thing about lying on a couch and all that. It's a relationship. You have to build a relationship, and you're not holding all the answers like Freud felt he was to the patient. You're in dialogue, creating a third thing together, and that's where the humanist psychologists built on that whole idea that the process was itself a work of art, the process of healing. And anyway, he was just full of wisdom, and he's been thoroughly ignored by the mainstream. But one thing that's interesting, the there's a school of social welfare, I guess it is, that is all built in Adirondacks. I think they made in Philadelphia. It's been going for decades. And because they understood right away the implication of his work for the poor and the oppressed, you see. That's why I love his work so much, that he's talking about the, getting through the oppression and the abuse. And again, creativity is key to it for him. We have to write our creativity. We have to get a healthy, so it chooses life and not death. And he also loved jazz. Whenever he visited New York, he went to Harlem first. He loved black jazz. And it did something for us. And he loved Huck Finn. He would sign his letters, Huck Finn. And one thing about him too, and I consider him a holy man. Why? Because he was never bitter, even though he was treated terribly by the Freudians. They actually contacted his publisher, Knopf, in New York, and said, if you publish his work, we will not give you any of Freud's work after this. He did not carry bitterness. In fact, he had a correspondence with Freud that's come out in the last few years. So he didn't totally break a relationship. But I consider that a great soul, where he didn't dwell on the betrayals of his life. He moved on, and he kept a sense of humor. That's why he would sign his letters Huck, as in Huck Finn. And I'll tell you this one last story. He died in Lake Tahoe writing the last book, Beyond Psychology. And he said, someday in Northern California, they will understand what I've been trying to say. And I have goosebumps telling you that, because I feel I do understand what he's trying to say. And I've always taught him in my school, the psychology of Adirondacks, because for me, he's my favorite psychologist. I respect Jung and all that and others, but he was so prophetic, he was so ahead of his courageous, and he lived a good life. And I honor that.
Matthew, your list has been, and your speaking about your list has been such a rich experience, more than usual, because from what we've heard, we've not just heard about the books and how much you love the books and the intimate stories behind the books. We've learned so much about the authors and your relationship with them on one level or another. So it's been like having a course. Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I'm very. I asked that question before, so I praise you for your question. Though like I confessed, it was a damn hard question to answer, because I left out a lot of books.
Yeah, indeed. I'm very conscious of your time, so it's gone. Yes, it's definitely gone past an hour and a half. I have two questions for you, and perhaps we could do them fairly quickly. The first is, I want to know about your latest book, Essential Writings on Creation Spirituality. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, well, this is the book, and I'm smiling because on the cover, because I'm sitting in Meister Eckhart's choir stall in Erfurt, Germany, where he was a prior for 8 years. And amazingly, Eckhart lived in the 14th century. That church was not bombed or in any way destroyed in all those centuries, in all those wars in Germany over those centuries. So it's quite a miracle that place still exists. And I taught a course there a few summers ago for a week. In the very rooms where Eckhart taught the novices, I taught Meister Eckhart. And I brought an artist with me who's a sun dancer. And he, in the afternoon, he put Meister Eckhart to movement, to dance. So everybody was dancing Eckhart's teachings that they had learned in the morning. So that was a wonderful week. I also brought a Jungian therapist and friend with me who dealt with dreams, because I felt people would have good dreams in that morphic resonance space of Eckhart's memory. Mm-hmm. And another artist meditation class that we offered. So, but this book is a collection of from my books. So it's kind of an anthology or something, but it's part of a series called Modern Spiritual Master Series that Orbis Books has put out. And they've had a lot of, wonderful figures in here, Flannery O'Connor and Thich Nhat Hanh, of course, and Albert Schweitzer and Richard Bohr and Sister Joan Chittister, Thierry de Chardin, and so forth. So I'm proud to be part of that company. But what they did was Charles Burak really did the book. He's a Jewish scholar, the Kabbalah and so forth. He was head of humanities department at JFK University for years. And he read all my books, bless his soul, poor guy. And he drew sections from all of them. And I had some say in it too. I kind of supervised, if you will. We had discussions. But and then I end the book with a letter to young people, because I think this newer generation has some real opportunities and obviously some challenges ahead. And it's divided by different sections, like the mystics, because I've written a lot about the mystics, but what creation spirituality is, and of course the role of social justice and education and work, because I've written about all those things, and of course the divine feminine, and this one, because I wrote a major book on what is healthy masculinity. How do we get to the sacred masculine and throw off the burden of patriarchy? Because patriarchy is a way of seeing the world. It's a philosophy. It's not something that all men are practicing or that all men are responsible for. But we do have to wake up about what the alternatives can be. So in that book, I lay out 10 archetypes, like Father Sky and the green man, the blue man, spiritual warrior, hunter-gatherer. These archetypes that are very ancient and very healthy and demand a lot of us. And these are the way, I think, to get back to an authentic masculinity for both women and men. For both women and men. Women are walking around with a toxic masculine inside of them too, in part. And at least one of them is on the Supreme Court. So that's what this new book is about. It's a collection of my writings over the years. So it's a shortcut to creation and spirituality we've been talking about today.
Thank you. So the last question I want to ask you, let me preface it by saying that the award-winning author, speaker, and teacher of world religions, Mirabai Starr, claims that there is not another man on the planet who has championed the sacred feminine with a fraction of the wisdom, scholarship, creative fire, and holy chutzpah as Matthew Fox. That would make a brilliant epitaph. If you were to write your own epitaph, what might it say?
Well, I'm grateful to Mirabai Starr. She and I taught a course together on Julian Norwich just a year or so ago on the Shift Network, and it was a lot of fun. And she translated Julian, a wonderful translation, and I wrote a new book on Julian during the pandemic. So we were good teammates in that instance. So we've come to know each other well. So I'm very grateful. Epitaph. Well, one of my chosen enemies. I didn't choose him as an enemy, but he chose me as an enemy. Was my Dominican provincial when I was expelled from the Dominican order. Previous to that, for several years, he supported me. But then the pressure from Rome was just too great before it really got to him. And he signed the papers to expel me, even though the Dutch Dominicans in Holland, they wrote a formal request to him saying, we will adopt Matthew, and he can continue to work in California. They said, we've been protecting theologians for 700 years. We know how to do it. You Americans don't know how to do it, so we'll do it. And then that would be a wonderful burden off of him, I thought. But he turned that down because you have to have permission from your previous provincial to join a new province. But he said to the New York Times, my former provincial, and I think this is one of the better compliments I've ever had. He said to the New York Times, well, he said, society turned right and the church turned right and Matthew Fox did not. So I think that's one of the best compliments I've ever had. I think it summarizes what a lot of my trouble was. And it doesn't come from an ally like Julian, like Mireille Starr. It comes from a person who chose to make himself my enemy, I
That
guess.
would be a brilliant epitaph to have on the headstone, because forevermore people will read that and go, I wonder what he did. And then they'd have to find out. Matthew Fox, thank you so much for adding your 10 best list to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations. I've thoroughly enjoyed every moment we've had together. I know we've run a little bit over time, but it's been well worth it.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your fine questions, including your initial one. And thank you for the title of your book club. It's my favorite title.
Good. Pass it on. You can learn more about Matthew Fox's books, articles, events, speaking appearances, just about everything that he's doing. And he's doing some amazing stuff, believe me, at matthewfox.org. And you can also check out Daily Meditations with matthewfox.org. That's it for this week. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of the No BS Spiritual Book Club's 10 Best Interviews. Till then, it's goodbye from me. Thank you, Matthew.